Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the money you have in the bank can no longer buy anything. Not because it disappeared, because there is simply nothing to buy. The shelves are empty. The trucks never arrived. The factory stopped. And the system you considered solid, the same one that paid your salary, stocked your supermarket, and heated your home, simply stopped working from one day to the next. This is not science fiction. This happened. And when it happened, the only thing that separated those who ate from those who did not was not their bank balance. It was the land beneath their feet and the knowledge of how to use it. There is a truth that the modern financial system does not tell you. The greatest protection a human being can have is not an investment in dollars. It is not a diversified portfolio. It is not gold stored in a vault. It is the ability to produce food when everything around collapses. That statement may sound exaggerated, but history, and not just any history, recent history, lived by millions of people, proves that it is absolutely real. To understand why this matters so much today, it is necessary to go back to a specific moment in history. A moment when an entire country lost, within a matter of months, practically everything that sustained its economy. A moment when the system that seemed unshakable simply disappeared. And what saved that population was not any government policy, no financial rescue package, no emergency fund. It was the land, and the hands willing to work it. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For most of the world, this was a political event. For Cuba, it was an immediate and devastating economic catastrophe. Within months, the island lost 80% of all its imports. Oil disappeared, fertilizers disappeared, agricultural machinery disappeared, external credit disappeared. The country had built its entire agriculture on inputs that came from abroad, and suddenly, those inputs simply ceased to exist. The result was a food crisis of proportions that few modern countries have faced. Empty shelves, widespread malnutrition, an epidemic of blindness caused by the lack of basic nutrients, adults losing their sight because the body did not have enough vitamins to keep the eyes functioning, children being born underweight, entire families dividing portions that could barely sustain one person. And here is something that needs to be said clearly. Cuba was not a country poor in agricultural knowledge. It was a country that had traded agricultural knowledge for industrial efficiency. A country that had bet everything on an external supply chain. And when that chain was cut, there was no local alternative to replace it. This is the trap that no traditional economist likes to discuss. Highly efficient systems are, by nature, highly fragile. The more optimized a system is, the less capacity it has to survive an unexpected shock. And the world we live in today is more optimized, and therefore more fragile, than at any other moment in history. What happened next in Cuba will surprise you, because the solution did not come from where anyone expected. It did not come from the government. It did not come from international organizations. It did not come from foreign aid or economic packages. It came from something much simpler, much older, and much more powerful than any public policy could ever be. But before getting there, it is necessary to understand one fundamental thing. Why did the world reach this point of extreme dependence? Why did entire nations lose the ability to feed themselves? The answer lies in a discovery made more than 80 years before the Cuban crisis. A discovery that changed everything, fed billions of people, and at the same time created a hidden vulnerability that still governs the fate of entire countries today. If you are enjoying this content, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave in the comments which city or country you are watching from. It makes a huge difference for us to keep bringing stories like this. In 1909, a German chemist named Fritz Haber made a discovery that would change the destiny of humanity. He achieved something scientists had considered impossible until then, transforming nitrogen from the air, an abundant element, making up nearly 78% of the atmosphere, into ammonia. A simple reaction on paper, brutal in practice, and one that opened the path to the large-scale production of synthetic fertilizers. The impact was immediate and irreversible. With synthetic fertilizers available in industrial quantities, agricultural productivity exploded. Land that once sustained a single family began to feed dozens. Regions that had been agricultural deserts became breadbaskets. Hunger, which had pursued humanity for millennia, seemed finally defeated. The world population, which took all of human history to reach 1 billion people, doubled, tripled, quadrupled in less than a century. But all this abundance had a hidden cost that no one wanted to see. To produce synthetic fertilizers at scale, natural gas is required. To transport them, global logistics is needed. To apply them efficiently, heavy machinery, specific seeds, and chemical pest control are necessary. What Haber created was not just an agricultural solution. It was an invisible chain that tied the world's food supply to a fragile, expensive, and geographically concentrated industrial system. And the world embraced that chain without realizing what it was doing. Monocultures spread across entire continents. Millions of hectares planted with a single variety, optimized for maximum productivity, completely dependent on external inputs. Ancestral knowledge of how to farm without chemicals, how to diversify production, how to preserve native seeds. This knowledge was abandoned generation after generation, replaced by convenience, scale, efficiency. The problem with extremely efficient systems is that they have no margin. They work perfectly as long as every piece is in place. But when one piece fails, natural gas prices spike, a shipping route is blocked, a drought destroys harvests in a supplying region. The entire system trembles. And the more integrated and optimized it is, the more violent the shock becomes. Cuba experienced this shock at maximum scale when the Soviet Union disappeared. But Cuba was not the only case. And here begins something most people were never taught in school. During World War II, the United Kingdom faced a German naval blockade that cut off much of its food imports. The British government responded with a campaign called Dig for Victory. Ornamental gardens were turned into vegetable plots. Public parks became fields of production. Backyards, rooftops, any available piece of land was used. Millions of British families began producing part of what they put on the table. In the United States, at the same time, the phenomenon repeated on an even larger scale. 20 million home gardens, called victory gardens, produced, at their peak during the war, approximately 40% of all vegetables consumed in the country. 40%, not of a specific crop, of all vegetable consumption in one of the largest economies in the world. But what happened to this knowledge after the war ended? It disappeared. It was replaced by supermarkets, processed food, convenience. The generation that learned to grow food out of necessity did not pass that knowledge on to their children. The children did not pass it on to their grandchildren. And today, the overwhelming majority of people living in developed cities would not know how to grow a tomato plant if their survival depended on it. This loss is not trivial. It is a structural vulnerability that accumulated silently over decades, and one that the current economic system makes increasingly difficult to see, because as long as everything works, no one feels the absence of what they don't know they've lost. What the history of the United Kingdom and the United States shows is not only that it is possible to produce food at an urban scale during a crisis. It shows that when necessity arrived, people were able to rebuild in months a local food system that had been abandoned for decades. The capacity was there, dormant, waiting to be activated. And in Cuba, when the crisis arrived without warning and without precedent, that is exactly what happened, but in a way that no one had planned and that very few experts had predicted. What happened in Cuba starting in 1991 has no precedent in modern history, not because the crisis was the most severe ever recorded, but because the response that emerged from it came from a place that no government planned, no economist predicted, and no international institution organized or even clearly anticipated. While the Cuban state was trying to find diplomatic and economic solutions to the collapse, the population had already begun to act on its own. Without waiting for official guidance, without financial resources, without industrial inputs, with land, seeds, and a knowledge that still remained in some older hands, people began to plant. First in backyards, then on rooftops, next in the vacant lots that existed by the thousands in a city like Havana, in the ruins of abandoned buildings, along the edges of roads, on any surface that could receive soil, water, and return productive life. This is how something was born that the entire world would begin to study in the following decades: the organoponicos, intensive urban gardens, without chemical fertilizers, based on composting, cooperation, and the maximum use of every available space. It was not advanced technology. It was basic knowledge, applied with urgency and creativity by people who simply had no other option. In less than a decade, Havana, a city of more than 2 million inhabitants, began producing internally more than 70% of the fresh vegetables consumed by its population. 70%. In a metropolis, without synthetic fertilizers, without heavy machinery, without the industrial chain that the world had considered absolutely indispensable to feed a city of that size. This was not a miracle. It was the clearest demonstration ever recorded that the human capacity to produce food does not depend on any system. It depends on knowledge and the willingness to use it when necessary. But Cuba was not the only place where this kind of collapse left permanent lessons. There's an even less well-known example, which reveals something disturbing about what happens when a country loses complete dietary diversity. 19th century Ireland grew basically one thing: the lumper potato, a single variety, on a national scale, with no diversification, no alternative, no margin for error. When a fungus called Phytophthora infestans attacked the crops in 1845, there was nothing to replace what was lost. The shelves did not just become empty. They became empty with no prospect of when they would be filled again. More than 1 million people died. Another million emigrated. Ireland lost between a quarter and a third of its population in less than a decade. Not due to lack of land, not due to lack of rain, due to lack of diversity. For having bet everything on a single card and seeing that card completely destroyed. The lesson of the Great Irish Famine is different from the Cuban lesson, but it complements it with a brutality that cannot be ignored. It is not enough to produce. It is necessary to diversify. It is necessary to have real alternatives. A food system that depends on a single product, a single input, a single supply chain is not a system. It is a bet, and the world today is making that bet on a planetary scale. Fertilizers whose prices have doubled and tripled in recent years due to geopolitical shocks. Maritime routes that concentrate the flow of grains from entire continents passing through choke points where any regional conflict becomes a global food crisis. Seeds patented by corporations that control what can and cannot be planted on a commercial scale. A concentration of power over food production that has not existed at any other moment in human history. All of this creates a fragility that does not appear in any conventional economic indicator. It is not in GDP. It is not in inflation rates. It is not in credit rating reports. It is hidden exactly where the most dangerous vulnerabilities tend to hide, in the assumptions that no one questions because everything is still working. Until the day it stops working. And when it stops, as Cuba showed, as Ireland showed, as the United Kingdom and the United States showed during the war, the only real protection that remains is the one that no bank issues and no brokerage sells. The financial protection that the world has spent centuries trying to build, in gold, in fiat currency, in digital assets, in diversified portfolios, has a blind spot that almost no one discusses. It assumes that the system around it continues working. That banks open. That supermarkets receive deliveries. that logistics chains operate, that the dollar still buys something on shelves. When that assumption fails, what remains? Cuba answered that question in the most concrete way possible. The answer was not in any financial asset. It was in the land, in the seeds, and in the knowledge of how to transform one into the other. It was in community networks formed without central planning, because people needed each other to survive. This is not an argument against investing. It is not a call to abandon the financial system. It is something more precise. It is the recognition that real resilience has layers. And most people who think about financial protection only take care of the most superficial ones. The deepest layer, the one that supports all the others, is the ability to produce value when the exchange system breaks down. And producing food is the most fundamental form of that ability. Not because it is the only one, but because it is the one nothing can replace. You can live without the internet. You can live without a bank account. You can live without access to financial markets. You cannot live without eating. The Soviets understood this in a way central planners never fully admitted. The dachas, small private plots of land cultivated by families on weekends, occupied only 3% of the country's total agricultural area. But they produced, in some periods, up to 30% of all the food consumed in the Soviet Union. When the state system collapsed in the 1990s, it was these plots that softened the impact for millions of families. Not central planning, not large industrial complexes. The backyards. The lesson that runs through all these cases, Cuba, Ireland, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, is not that the world is going to end. It is simpler and more practical than that. Complex systems fail, sometimes for decades without showing signs. Then, quickly, in ways no one anticipated. And when they fail, protection does not come from those who accumulated the most money. It comes from those who had the most installed capacity to produce, to collaborate, to adapt with what was at hand. Real skills have a value that no financial instrument can replicate. Money can inflate. It can lose purchasing power through monetary policy. It can be frozen by regulatory decisions. A dollar account can be worth much less in real terms 10 years from now. But knowing how to grow food, preserve it, build local exchange networks, that knowledge does not inflate. It does not depreciate. It cannot be confiscated by any central bank. This does not mean saving dollars is wrong. It means saving only dollars is incomplete. True diversification, the kind validated by the most extreme historical cases, includes diversification of capabilities, not just assets. It includes having some level of food autonomy. It includes belonging to networks where real skills are exchanged. It includes preserving knowledge that modern comfort makes unnecessary, until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. Cuba was not saved because it had dollar reserves. It was saved because, when the moment came, there were people willing to plant on rooftops. The United Kingdom did not survive the naval blockade because of the Treasury's balance sheet. It survived because 20 million gardens produced real food while the ships did not arrive. The greatest financial protection that exists does not have a stock ticker. It does not have an app code. It does not have an account manager. It has roots. It has seeds. It has the memory of how things grow. If you made it this far, you already understand that the right question is not only where to store what you have, but what you would be able to produce if the system around you stopped for a while. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share in the comments which city or country you're watching from. It helps the channel grow and continue bringing stories like this.